It's been almost half a year since Prime Minister Netanyahu scrapped a plan with the UN to safely resettle nearly half of Israel's African asylum seekers in Western countries. Today, that community's future is still very much in limbo, and contributing to that confusion, the Israeli government has just announced two very different proposals, which would assign this community to very different fates. TV's Brett Allen Smith is here with the updates. Brett?
Hi, thanks, Aaron. So like you said, we're now hearing about two different ideas that each kind of represent the spectrum of debate around this entire issue. So the Israeli government has long branded this community of nearly 40,000 migrants as illegal infiltrators who only came for jobs. But I will say that the vast majority are mostly Christians and from Eritrea and Sudan who say that they fled genocide, war, and essentially a life service in a slave army for a life of freedom elsewhere. Now, many thousands have also shared some quite gruesome accounts of torture on their way to Israel. Now, typically, asylum seekers from Eritrea and Sudan particularly are almost universally accepted as refugees all over the world. That status, however, has been granted to less than 0.4% of asylum seekers currently in Israel, just to put it out there.
Right. Okay, so this brings us to what the future holds for this community. And I know that the state has offered temporary residency to some asylum seekers from Sudan and Darfur in recent months. What are the new proposals moving forward then?
Okay, so one plan is very welcomed by this community, and the other not so much. So the first plan we'll talk about, it's a government program to invest something like $7.5 million into programs to help this community integrate into the country, Tel Aviv, north, south, everywhere. Now that would mostly include economic and social relief. Ironically, today the High Court is hearing a petition against a law that requires employers to deduct 20% of asylum seekers' paychecks. The government holds that money in a separate trust as kind of an incentive, let's say, to compel that individual to leave the country, basically to deport themselves. So if the government is planning on investing $7+ million into economic relief, that law may be a place to start.
Okay, so, and now I'm assuming that the other idea on the table reflects the opposite end of the spectrum then, people who think that this community has no right to be here at all.
Correct. Okay, so the second idea is basically a return to the old idea, which is the deportation of men, women, and children against their will back to Africa. But the big difference here now is that in the past, this would have been deportation to a third unspecified African country, typically with alleged human rights violations. In this case, things recently have changed in Eritrea. The Eritrean government recently signed a peace deal with Ethiopia, which was huge. So now the government is exploring the possibility of deporting them simply back to Eritrea. Now, the problem there is that these people are basically seen as wanted criminals back in their home country of Eritrea, regardless of that country's relationship with Ethiopia. Israel, of course, is required to assess the human rights conditions in Eritrea or wherever they would want to deport someone. That analysis has actually been sealed from the public as recently as yesterday, likely because it would basically work against those efforts to deport them there. Eritrea has a questionable human rights record anyway. Anyway, those are the two ideas that are on the table.
Well, many are still wondering if Israel could eventually return to that original deal with the United Nations that Netanyahu himself publicly hailed as the best possible option on TV, only then to scrap it mere hours later following opposition from his coalition.
Right.
This is obviously a very personal issue to many, with Holocaust survivors actually even coming out to support these African asylum seekers and their right to live freely in Israel. In any event, we'll have to see where this goes. Thanks for the update, Brett.
Of course.